Chris Lee, Blake Lovell, and Blayne Gilmer of Southeastern 14 here as we continue our preview series of SEC football teams for the 2023 season. Today we get to Mississippi State, a program that I called as my sleeper team a year ago. I think that would be a prediction. This is the team that's still got a lot of guys left, lost some key guys. We'll get to that in a little bit. But more importantly, no program in the country was touched by tragedy the way State was a year ago. Lost, I think, a walk-on lineman midseason to a tragic death. And then, of course, Mike Leach, as everybody knows. But in spite of all that, State was a program that kept persevering, won, I think, 9 games, won a bowl game against a decent Illinois team. And here State is under new management with Arnett, Blake. What are your initial thoughts on the Bulldogs coming into this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think we've used the word. I know Blayne used it in another preview we did. I don't remember which team it was, but it was sort of continuity was what we talked about, and trying to keep that, and that's clearly what, they've done here at Mississippi State. They're trying to keep that continuity, even though we know it's going to mean there's going to be a lot of change offensively, but you do get Will Rogers back. You get some guys back, all SEC linebackers. You've got multiple options there. And so I think when you just look at the talent they're bringing back, they're good enough to perhaps, like you said, Chris, maybe be a sleeper team again this season, because I think a lot of people are going to pick them lower. I know we did in terms of doing our summer predictions and all that. But, still there's a lot of guys coming back that will be impact players. There's a lot of guys I think they're bringing in that are going to be impact players. But it really just is seeing how they adjust, to a new offense and adjusting to not having as many starters back on the defensive side, even though the talent's there. So, so I think there are obvious strengths for this team, but I think there are some obvious questions in terms of whether they can keep that momentum going with, again, change being a main theme with this team.
Yeah, and as Blake said, there's a lot of playmakers coming back, like guys that have caught a lot of balls, albeit in the air raid. There's still guys that have experience playing in the SEC and running routes in the SEC against SEC defenses. Now they've got to learn a little bit different nuance of things with Kevin Barbay coming in from App State, bringing more of a pro-style look. But, man, if you go look at some of App State stuff from last year, some of their stats and their numbers, they aired it out at plenty as well at different times, but also you would see changes. You'd see a 400-yard passing game or a 300-yard rush game mixed in there between there. So I think balance is going to be the key. They're going to have more balance. They've got a talented running back in Jaquavius Marks. We'll talk more about him. But, my goodness, I just think you've got to, if you're a Mississippi State faithful, you just got to put a lot of your eggs in the basket of Will Rogers has navigated this league, and now he's going to get a chance to do so with a system that's even more quarterback driven than the other one was.
Yeah, let's start with the quarterback room. It's just I don't know what the word is here. The Mike Wright transfer just puzzled me because it's not at all what they've done. Of course, I think they're going to try to maintain some continuity. They're adding a tight end. I'm sure you'll get into that a little bit later, Blayne, because you were very high on their additions to that room, and there were a couple of them. But I know State fans always get upset when Will Rogers doesn't make the higher echelon all-conference teams. But here's the knock on him is when you get more into an analytics-driven area, it was 6.5 yards a pass a year ago. And there's not a lot of mobility there. He lost almost 200 yards rushing, although those were really more pass attempts. But at the same time, look, if I'm starting a team from scratch, I got Will Rogers as my quarterback. I'm perfectly fine with that. He's a smart kid. He's been around a while. And this offense is going to be fine with him at the helm, Blayne, I think, even if there are some changes.
Yeah, he was so excited about talking in SEC media days about how he faced a lot of drop 8 in the air raid, right? Meaning they only rushed 3 guys and dropped 8 defenders out, so there weren't a whole lot of windows. It was tough to fit the ball in. He says, now when we got a running threat, when we're able to, in the pro-style system, to actually establish the run. We've got some tight ends where we can go 12 personnel in there and get some play action. Blake, you said that. He was excited about the play action. Why? Because what does that do? That creates not only a horizontal but a vertical stretch in that defense where they're on different levels because they're honoring the run. And now Will Rogers says, hey, I've got more room to throw the football in. For a guy that's been as successful as he has, Blake, already, and is in position to break all kinds of SEC records this year, defensive coordinators have to be a little bit worried hearing him with that excitement in his voice saying, hey, I've got more room to throw the football here. I think that is good news for Mississippi State. And then to your point, Chris, with Mike Wright coming in, they may be able to do some quarterback runs, some wildcat package type stuff because he's a unbelievable runner type deal. So they may be able to add that to their system. So Blake, I think that there's going to be, we don't really know what to expect, except I think we know to expect a high quality, high level of play out of Will Rogers.
But see, that's the interesting part for me is like we talk about adjustments that Mississippi State's going to have to make, but what about everybody else that's playing Mississippi State that's so used to knowing, even if you feel like at times you can't stop it, but what the basic foundation is of what they're going to do on a game in game out basis. That's what you knew kind of when Mike Leach was there. But now it's like we got a lot of intrigue about as to how they're going to use a lot of different guys, and I think that specifically goes back to Will Rogers in terms of how that opens up things for him. And yeah, we were laughing about, his excitement for being able to do more play action stuff and, have more motion and just all kinds of things. And I think that just opens up a lot in terms of what they're going to be able to at least try to do with this new look offense. And so I don't know how many games we're going to look up and he's going to have, 45 or more pass attempts, which was the majority of, many seasons he's been there. I don't know what that number looks like this season, but I think there's some people who are kind of overcorrecting, I think, on that and saying, oh, well, they're going to get back to where he's only going to throw the ball 25 times or something. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I do think they have a lot of options as to which way they can go here. And like I said, I think maybe you can look at it as an adjustment period, but it's also an adjustment period for the opponent because you don't really, even though you know what kind of offense it is, you don't really know how they're going to use some of these guys, whether, it's a Jaquavius Marks, whether it's, kind of how they said, how they use Mike Wright, maybe in some different things. So I think that makes it intriguing.
Just so you know, App State averaged under Kevin Barbay averaged 30 pass attempts per game last year. So a good balance there.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting thing about them that was happening under Mike Leach, guys. And I think stats for them especially get skewed when you're not running the ball a lot. And then a lot of what's counted as a rushing play is really a sack of a Will Rogers, which, as we said, that happened a few times, and he's not a guy that's going to offset that with rushing yards of his own. State actually, the last 3 years, percentage of rushing plays attempted from 2020 to last year, 22% to 24% to 29%. So they were already getting, run heavy would be an exaggeration, but they were leaning more in the direction of the run as it was, and it had improved when they ran the ball. They went from 4.3 per rushing attempt to 4.4 to last year 4.9, which brings me to their backfield. Jaquavius Marks back this year. He is a pass catcher extraordinaire. If you're playing in a college football, fantasy football, PPR league, that's a guy you want because he catches a ton of balls. They brought in Jeff Pittman as a JUCO guy to, I would presume, take some carries there. Kavon Lee from Penn State, who 2 years ago ran for over 500 yards, caught over 100 yards worth of passes. Receiving core, they lose Ra Thomas, but they bring back Jaden Wiley, who caught 34 balls for them a year ago. Justin Robinson, who caught 30. Lydiatric Griffin, who caught 40. They brought in a couple of JUCO transfers. They brought in Freddie Robinson from Eastern Washington. I don't know those guys. They'll be big guys. And then Creed Whittemore, who was one of their highly regarded recruits this year. Look, they spread the ball around, but it'd be interesting to me, and I'll start with you, Blayne, just to see kind of what their run-pass balance is. And then, again, all these weapons that they've got to see, does it emerge as more of a spread it around target share, or does somebody step up and maybe put up bigger numbers than we've seen in the past?
Yeah, and Rufus Harvey was actually their leading guy in terms of receptions last year. So they had a guy who, I mean, he comes back and him and Will Rogers have a great rapport. But Justin Robinson is a guy that I would look at that would have more success, I think, in this pro style system. Originally a Georgia Bulldog, got recruited. Georgia liked him a lot. He ended up getting behind a couple guys on the depth chart over there, elected to go be a Bulldog in the western side of the SEC versus the eastern side. And, I don't know that the air raid was a tremendous fit for him, but he's a big receiver that can run, track the ball really well. I think that Justin Robinson is in for a nice year, 6'4", 220, can go up and catch the ball at the highest point. I really like that as well. And you mentioned Jaquavius Marks at the running back position, PPR type guy, catch the ball out of the backfield, but he's chomping at the bit to get those carries in Blake. Like he's ready to carry more of that load. They didn't run the ball a ton, and he had to split the load last year, but the other running back transferred out. Now Jaquavius Marks gets to kind of be the bell cow for this offense there. I really like what they have around them. And then, of course, they've got around Will Rogers, and then, of course, they've got some transfer tight ends coming in as well.
Yeah, I was going to say with Marks, I think he's improved his rushing yards every year, but it's been like, 100 yards here, 150 yards there, I think over the first, 3 seasons he's been there. But now it's like, I mean, I don't know if he completely doubles it, but like it's a substantial jump, I think, in the way he's going to be using this offense in terms of just running the ball. And like Chris said, he can certainly catch the ball too. So yeah, I think he's probably one guy I have on my list league wide that I'm most kind of excited to see just, statistically how that jump is made just based on being kind of in this offense and how they're going to use him, because he's a really good player. And that probably isn't always talked about enough just based on everybody's kind of just, always talked about the passing part of the equation, but he can run the ball.
Offensive line guys, what do we make of what they've got coming back? Blayne, I'll start with you.
Listen, in terms of this, they've got to learn. I'm not going to go too deep into, okay, you can't take much about it returning experience, because they were doing straight vertical pass sets and getting out in space. All these guys, they've got to learn. They've got to retrain how they're doing things. Literally, I heard Greg McElroy talking about how he saw one time at a Mike Leach practice, they were learning to hold the guy as they fall down, because they were going vertical and setting deep and letting the quarterback get deep in his set. That's going to be a lot different. I think the pass sets are going to be a little bit more aggressive in that kind of stuff. They're going to get more downhill in the run game type deal. But you look across this offensive line and you see a bunch of guys who have been there for a while there or are very experienced. I mean, you see senior, graduate, senior transfer, graduate. There is experience across the offensive line. And now it's just, okay, how does Will Rogers and this offensive line communicate in doing things like setting the mic point, moving different protections, things like that they didn't necessarily have to do. It was more full slide one way, split protection here and there. But now they have a lot of more on their plate in terms of, okay, we've got to identify before the snap, things like that. So that is going to be a question there. But I think Will Rogers, I think, Cole Smith at the center position haven't been around. I think that is something that those two are going to relish working through together, Blake.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, I would say this is probably the biggest, I would say, question. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean, like you said, Blayne, it's an adjustment to what they're going to have to do in this particular offense versus the one that they, have ran a lot more, and having the experience and being older helps, but it's now building that experience within the new offense. And I think that's going to be one of the more, bigger questions I think that they'll have coming into the season, and seeing how everyone adjusts on the line there.
Well, where they won't have questions is at linebacker. And if there's a duo that's produced a lot more than these guys, I'd like to know Nathaniel Watson. I think he and Jett Johnson were both top 5 tackles a year ago. Is that right, guys? But I mean, those are the two guys that are back, and you're going to see them all over preseason All SEC lists up front. Not a star-studded group, but You got Russell and Davis, I guess, at one end spot. They both played a lot of games last year, both racked up some numbers here and there with I think they combined for in the neighborhood of 40 tackles at that end spot. Nathan Pickering, their nose tackle, is back. He played 12 games a year ago, 5.5 stops for loss. And Jaden Crumity, who played just 5 games a year ago, probably the biggest name in that bunch, had 5 stops for loss in those 5 games. So you look at up front groups, and Blake, I'll start with you. This will probably be one of the more experienced guys in terms of continuity returning for the same team that we'll see in the league.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. I mean, when you can start with Johnson and Watson, I don't know, that's good enough right there. And then you have whatever, they have around them. And like I said, Johnson 115, Watson 113 in terms of total tackles last year, combined for 8 sacks. Of course, Watson had 6 of those. And yeah, I mean, it's just again, when you have guys like that leading the way and just the experience of this group, I think that absolutely stands out and will be one of the strongest parts of this entire team, without question. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot more to add, Chris. I mean, this is a really, really talented front part of this defense. And again, you've got 2 all SEC linebackers coming in that, quite frankly, will be 2 all SEC linebackers once again, barring injury. So,
yeah, I mean, you just don't have 2 guys that have recorded over 100 tackles in a season, because that is just unheard of. And again, with, like we mentioned, with the offensive line, you look down this roster, you see graduates, you see seniors. I mean, you see experience here, guys that have played for years under Zach Arnett's defense. And I know Zach Arnett's now the head coach, but he is going to be, as a first-year head coach, he will stay very involved in that defense. I can assure you. It takes a while for these guys to learn that they're not Superman and they have to hire somebody. Hey, look at Jimbo Fisher. We just talked about that in the Texas A&M. He's been coaching for a minute, and he's finally just now getting an offensive coordinator over there, we think. But Zach Arnett's still going to be really heavily involved in that. And guys, even from front to back, I mean, you're talking about, you mentioned Nathan Pickering at nose tackle, a senior that's going to be there. We know what they have at linebacker. A guy like Jett Johnson, that's just a great football name, by the way. Just he wins the SEC Football Name of the Year award, in my opinion. Jett Johnson, that's a great one. And then guys like Sean Preston have been around forever, okay, that are playing. His position is listed as the dog position, okay? What do you not like about that if he's the dog of the defense over there? So I think this team is going to be very tough defensively in terms of the starting 11. As always, with some of these teams who are fighting to go from a middle tier team to a higher tier team in the SEC, Chris, it's about how much depth can you create and how quickly can you do it? I think that'll be the question of this defense.
Yeah, and I think the other question will be, how do they replace Emmanuel Forbes? I don't know that you really replace him. And when we did our postseason awards last year after the regular season, I named him as a defensive MVP in the SEC. I just think to play corner at the level he did and make the plays that he did just was a ton of value there. I know there were bigger names that got more attention elsewhere. And look, you can't subtract a piece like that and not have it leave a mark. Not interestingly, I guess this is just what you do in college football. They brought in some transfers, I think, that seem to project as depth more than starters, although I guess we'll see. Chris Keys, free safety, transfers in from Indiana. Jacoby Albert, strong safety, transfers in from Kentucky. He'll be a second-year player there. They bring back, let's see, I think they got just maybe one starter returning there in terms of guys coming back in the secondary. I think that's Richardson, who'll play the other corner. They had a couple of corners transfer too. I knew I was missing something. Kamari Rogers from Miami was a highly rated player at a high school 2 years ago. Ray Darius Jones at LSU, was a 2019 grad. I think probably maybe more experienced than a guy that's going to come in and challenge for a starting job. Blayne, I'll start with you. What do you make of the state of their backfield, and how much does it hurt to lose an elite corner like Emmanuel Forbes?
I mean, it hurts to lose a guy like Emmanuel Forbes, but even if guys weren't in the role, right? There are guys that have been around other SEC programs. When you talk about Marcus Banks, that was at Alabama, and now he's now at Mississippi State, and then Sean Preston's been around. They've got guys who have been around. They've heard, whether it's Zach Arnett's voice, whether it's Pete Golden's voice at Alabama, whether it's different places, they've got guys who have been in the league. They know what it takes to succeed. Now Zach Arnett is going to have them, under his mold there. He's still going to be heavily involved in that defense, like I said. But yes, Emmanuel Forbes was an eraser of problems, right? Because not only did he take the ball away, he scored with it. Okay. That is the biggest advantage that you can have for a defense to turn the game around. I don't know that they're going to have anybody that dynamic, but what you have to do is just be able to, they played a little bit different style than some SEC teams on defense. I think, just like I said with Alabama, right? I think it's hard for a defense week in and week out, even in the secondary, to have as much physicality as it needs to, Blake, when you're facing pass it all around the yard every day in practice, that type of deal, even in fall camp when it's good on good, stuff like that. It's hard to simulate some of that physicality. I think they're going to get more of that physicality in practice, in fall camp, and stuff like that, facing a more pro-style offense now. I think the defense will reap the benefits of that, even in the backfield when you're talking about seeing more of what other teams are going to do, more downhill runs, more play action, things like that. I think it'll only help sharpen those guys who are looking to replace those roles.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think that's what it's about. Is it's a different look now for the defense too, and especially when you're talking about in practice and everything you're going through to get ready for a season. So it will undoubtedly help. And I think again, you just keep looking at this group even without Forbes. And like Blayne said, it is somewhat impossible, I think, to replace a guy like that didn't just take the ball away, but he went and got you points on the board too, multiple times. And that is what we say. Keys to a great defense, teams that can force mistakes and be able to turn that into offense. And he was able to do that on his own. So yes, it's going to be tough to replace him, but at the same time, you go down this list and you still see guys that are older. I mean, honestly, guys, I look at the depth chart of Mississippi State. I think they've got to be the oldest team in the SEC. I mean, if you're just looking at it from an age standpoint in terms of seniors, grad, they've got to be, like, because I've looked at the other ones and I just don't think one through whatever. I just don't think that anyone else can kind of match that overall age and experience. Now, again, it's a little different in terms of experience if we're talking about offense because of things that are changing there. But yeah, I mean, you've still got some older guys here in this group. And even though you bring in some of the younger guys via transfer, I think you've still got experience. And so I think it will be a by committee thing in terms of just replacing a guy like Forbes, but it's not like this team lacks options, I think, and having the Zach Arnett effect, like we said, even though he's moving over to the head coach, he's still going to be a big part of what this defense does. And I think he probably knows exactly, the buttons they need to push in terms of putting the right guys in the right place on the backside here.
All right, before we wrap up, we always hit special teams. I won't really throw this open for discussion, but just mention some key points here. I don't know that there's a team in the country that wouldn't trade its return duo for what State's got between Griffin and Xavier Thomas. I think Griffin led the country in kickoff return average a year ago at over 32. Thomas was 13.5 as a true freshman per punt return last year. That's pretty elite. Kicking wise, they have succumbed to peer pressure and brought an Australian in, just like the rest of the league, to punt. And they brought in a transfer kicker from UCLA, Nick Barmira, who I think had struggled with consistency before. I don't know how much State will actually kick field goals. That wasn't
LA
really a point of emphasis in the past.
LA to Starkville. Culture shock for that young man.
Yes, that will be. But in any case, let's wrap it up on State, starting with you, Blake, and your final thoughts on the Bulldogs, perhaps something we didn't get to in our discussion.
Well, like you said, we've looked at the schedule elsewhere. If you want to watch a full video, we did on that. But I mean, I'm just going to repeat what we said in that. Having 8 home games is a luxury in the SEC. And when you have 8 home games and you're Zach Arnett taking over the program, that's a nice starting point, I think. And when you look at the schedule, guess who's in Starkville? LSU's in Starkville. Alabama's in Starkville. Kentucky's in Starkville, right? Ole Miss. I mean, so I think when you look at it from that standpoint, this to me is a season of opportunity for Mississippi State because we talked about it. An older group that is adjusting to a new offense, and that's going to be the biggest question I think all of us have is how do they adjust? What does the offense look like? What does Will Rogers look like? How do all the weapons around him, how are they used in this offense? And can it equate to what they need for what is a defense that maybe doesn't have a ton of returning starters, but still has experience and two guys leading the way that are as good as anybody in terms of having, what Johnson and Watson can do. So I think this Mississippi State team, I know Chris was kind of the phrase last year, but I think you can look at this team and say, if things start to click offensively, early on, maybe they're further than we think they're going to be. Because I think people will say it's going to be an adjustment period for X amount of weeks or whatever. And we'll know after game 3 because they're going to play LSU on September the 16th. But I think this could be, again, a team that sort of surprises some people just based on kind of the nucleus they have in place, both on the offensive side and the defensive side. But it's really just seeing, again, can they take advantage of what I think is a pretty good opportunity with the schedule they have? Not that it's an easy schedule, but getting those kind of games in Starkville, it's a nice thing to have, I think, if you're Zach Arnett. So,
yeah, managing emotions early in the season, Chris, because even though they played that bowl game last year and clearly they were playing for Mike Leach and had the pirate logo and all that kind of stuff, that first time in Wade Davis Stadium, first couple of times, they'll probably have some kind of video tribute. I wouldn't be surprised if Mike Leach is like part of the pregame pump up video type deal thing that goes on. Emotions are going to be everywhere. They can harness that in a good way. And Zach Arnett is able to, the first couple of weeks, kind of put his thumbprint on this team, change how this is a little bit of the mentality while keeping respect to some of the things that Leach had in that program. Then you're talking about an excited, liquored up, 12 o'clock cowbell shaking crowd over there with LSU coming to town. And when you got the ring-a-ling, jang-a-ling going on over there, it's got to be exciting. Okay. So you're going to have an opportunity to do something early. And Will Rogers has proven people wrong plenty of times before, and he's done so against LSU, in fact, in the past. So you just gotta watch and see early. But I think managing the emotions and being able to make that transition early is just going to be paramount for this crew, Chris.
Yeah, Blake mentioned 8 home games, and you mentioned the cowbells. If you've ever been to Starkville and sat in the stands and hear how loud those things get, I don't think the TV does it justice. I don't know how you hear yourself think if you're an opponent on the field, and I think that's obviously a big advantage for them. But I guess my parting thought is this. I was in the room at SEC Media Days, and I don't know how much this correlates to whether you succeed your first year as a coach or not. But I think if you had said, all right, watch all 14 coaches speak and tell me the one who's doing his first media days as a head coach, Zach Arnett's probably the guy I would have picked out. And that just kind of served as a reminder is you watch these other guys speak, and that's not so much a dig on Zach Arnett, but you're watching Hugh Freeze and you're watching Nick Saban, you're watching Brian Kelly, and guys that are just so used to being the front man of big time operations. And, Lane Kiffin even, and it just kind of reminds you, you're in a league of sharks. It's tough to win. And just, I think in a league where we're looking for reasons to separate teams. I think Mississippi State, that's the team that I picked last in the West, but I've said a million times, I don't think State's a bad team. I think State's probably a top 30 team nationally, top 35. That's a really good football team. Like if State ended up finishing 4th, winning 8 or 9 games, wouldn't be shocked. But you kind of look for separators. That to me is a little bit of one of them is you got a first-year head coach. You've got something along the lines of a scheme change or scheme tweak or whatever from a system that not a ton of people run, I guess. And then you've got some losses of some key guys like Forbes on one side and just losing a legend like Mike Leach, who was a tremendous coach and winning 9 games anywhere in the SEC, outside of maybe LSU and Georgia and Alabama is a real accomplishment. To do that in Starkville, he'd really started to leave his mark on the program. So I'm just wondering what the unwind of all that looks like. I think this is a really good team, but I just have questions along the lines of transition. And to me, that was kind of a separator, although I think you could easily have put Auburn 7th instead of State. So anyway, those are my parting thoughts on State. We have now previewed, I think, 13 of 14 SEC teams. I believe Ole Miss is the only one we've got left. That one will be coming soon. Best way to catch that, hit the subscribe button. If you hit the like button, that helps us out. And tell a friend. We cover the SEC in football, basketball, and baseball wall to wall. So I hope you'll come back and check out more of our content. For Blake Lovell and Blayne Gilmer, I'm Chris Lee of Southeastern 14. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.